8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. Rule number 5. Vampires go ballistic when they think you're in danger. "Stop staring at me," Hermione said.
"Do you know, your complexion has been looking much better lately. Have you been trying out a new skincare routine?"
Ginny asked. Hermione looked across at the mirror above the mantel and appraised herself. "I haven't. I think I've just been getting more sleep lately."
"The Hermione Granger getting sleep?" Ginny quipped. "No, I think that's impossible for you to do on your own. More likely,"
the youngest Weasley stated, steepling her fingers under her chin as if she considered a profound thought.
"I think you've been seeing more of whichever bloke you haven't told me about yet, and he isn't ensuring you stay in bed when you try to work."
Hermione's cheeks heated. "Ginny!" She didn't want to admit that her friend was closer to the truth than she realized. She grinned.
"I'm right, aren't I?"
Hermione shifted uncomfortably in the armchair, tempted to hide the heat on her cheeks by tossing the throw that was resting on her lap over her head. She looked up to see Ginny assessing her more seriously.
"Hermione,"
she said.
"Yes?"
Hermione said, almost squeaked. Ginny looked to be scrambling for the right words to say, twisting her hands in her long braided red hair.
Is there a reason why you won't tell me?"
As Hermione opened her mouth to protest, Ginny held up a hand.
"If you can't tell me yet, that's fine. I understand. I just want to know if you're safe with whoever he is."
Safe with a vampire? Hermione thought but didn't say it out. That depended on what one defined as safe. She shivered when she thought about the several bite marks on her neck which were currently hidden under her thick wool scarf. "I am," Hermione said honestly. "I'm not in danger and I trust him. I just want to see where it's going before it goes as far as you frightening him with an interrogation." Ginny let out an indignant huff, throwing a pillow from the couch at Hermione, who only laughed.
"I don't know if I should be offended or proud that you think me so scary."
"Harry's always had a thing for women in power," Hermione teased. Ginny grinned back.
"I expect a full report when you're ready."
Hermione smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Hermione had been thinking for weeks how to ask Draco this question, and seeing as the nice spring weather was refracting off the curtains, she decided it was a good time to bring it up. "Draco," she said. He replied. They were sitting on a couch Draco had brought in so they could sit together, in which they were currently planted on a Sunday, Draco's head in Hermione's lap, as he read a book on the philosopher Augustine, and Hermione was smoothing her finger through his soft hair. "It's really nice out today," she said. He peered up at the windows.
"Seems so," he said. "Did you know Augustine said a variation of Descartes, 'I think, therefore I am,' before Descartes did?"
"I did," she said. After a few seconds of silence, Hermione looked back down to see Draco staring at her. "Yes?"
"I'm waiting,"
he said. Hermione's brows furrowed.
"For what?" "For you to go on about whatever tangent pertains to that bit of information."
She blinked, then blushed. "It's perfectly normal to know things," he smirked, reaching up to caress her cheek.
"I like the way you explain things. You'd be a good teacher."
"Oh?" she asked, feeling warm from his compliment.
"I mean, you can be rather big swot about it, but yes, I think you would be."
She hit his chest. "Brat!"
"True,"
he agreed, rubbing his chest.
"Now, what's got your enormous brain distracted?"
Hermione bit her lip. "Well, I was wondering, do you think we could, if you want to?"
"Sorry, that isn't a form of Granger language I'm familiar with yet. You'll have to speak in English, I'm afraid, and or Latin as well, if that would be easier for you."
Rolling her eyes, she said quickly, "We should go outside somewhere." Draco blinked. He stared at Hermione long enough that she regretted ever saying anything.
"Ranger,"
he sighed.
"It's not that I don't want to, but do you really want to be seen in public with me?"
Hermione narrowed her eyes. "And why wouldn't I?" He huffed.
Oh, I don't know. Ex-Death Eater, bloodthirsty vampire, generally unpleasant person by most people's understanding.
Hermione hummed thoughtfully. I'm willing to concede more favourably on your third charge. Draco moved before she could blink, sitting up and grabbing Hermione. He positioned her to sit with her knees on either side of him, his hips flushed against hers. He moved her hair to the side and skimmed his fingers down her throat.
Not the second,
he asked, voice taunting. Rolling her eyes, she sat back on her heels, stood on his lap, and crossed her arms. Draco?
Granger?
Is that a no, then? She asked. He seemed hesitant.
Where would you like to go?
I was thinking somewhere in Mugglewood. Ironically, I think you would be more comfortable there.
You forget, I lived amongst Muggles for 4 years. But yes, I think that would be easier. Not that I'm embarrassed by you, so please don't.
Hermione kissed him, hands tangling in his hair again. Draco returned it, bringing her closer as one hand wrapped around her neck and the other dug into her hair, ruining the plait she had spent a good chunk of the morning trying to braid in an attempt to tame her curls. He tugged at a dark purple ribbon at the bottom, letting her hair loose and wild. She pulled back and glared at him. He smiled.
Oops.
She ignored him and looked down at her watch. Okay, I got us 2 tickets to the National Gallery in London. I think you would enjoy the exhibits there. And we have a few hours before it closes to go. He stared at her before narrowing his eyes.
You already bought tickets?
She cleared her throat, looking away innocently. I may have thought I could convince you.
That confident, are you?
He asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She turned back to him and smirked. He gaped at her a moment before standing, taking Hermione with him as he wrapped his arms around her. She thought he was going to put her down, but this seemed to not be the case when he shifted her over his back and started for the door.
Draco! She yelped. Let's get ready, then.
Yes, now put me down.
No.
Draco! As it turned out, Draco loved the gallery, more than even Hermione did. He stared with childlike wonder at Van Gogh's sunflower painting, marveling the same way Hermione did when she saw the vibrant sunflower's different yellow hues. They decided to go to a science center the weekend after, where they looked at rock collections and different ecosystems rooms, along with a view of the planetary systems in a cinema-style room, both of them enraptured by the movement of the star system. There was even a nail bed, which Draco was convinced was a Muggle torture device. When she laid on top of it to demonstrate that it was safe, his eyes bugged out of his head, and he lifted her clear off the table once the nails started rising. The Muggles who were around them looked on bemused, one woman shielding her child away from Draco as if he were some feral madman. A feral vampire, Hermione wanted to explain, but she hadn't the heart for jokes as she removed herself from Draco's arm and practically dragged him to the next room, embarrassed and murmuring death threats at him if he ever decided to play a chauvinist hero against Iron again. The bloody bastard had the nerve to laugh. She much more preferred the grim Monsieur when she poked him in the ribs. Well, I would argue that in both the Muggle and the Wizarding world it is mad of you to pick me up like some doll because you think I'm in danger. It is considerably stranger when you do it here. He smiled innocently at her before leaning down and whispering in her ear.
Just admit that you like being carried by me, Granger.
She pushed at his chest before huffing and turning away from him, marching towards the aquatic area. She didn't hear Draco behind her and was about to turn around to tell him to hurry up when she felt an arm around her waist, spinning around and backing her up into a quiet corner.
I'm very sorry for defending your honor against those sharp nails,
Draco said, his breath ghosting over her jaw as he kissed her. She felt breathless and dizzy as he left barely 3 touches on her skin.
"They're blunt, you tosser,"
she said, glaring up at him. He said, lips travelling a tantalizing trail to her lips. He almost moved him out of the way out of spite, and she at least somewhat felt embarrassed at potentially getting caught snogging, but the warmth of his body against hers was hard to resist. She fisted his shirt as their lips met and kissed him hungrily. Draco wrapped his arm around her waist as his other hand cupped her jaw, and Hermione seemed to lose track of all time for a while. It was only when they heard the announcement over the PA that the centre would be closing soon that Hermione pulled back, breathless. "We don't have enough time to explore the aquatic exhibition," she said, staring up at Draco. His cheeks were flushed, and Hermione felt a thrill that she was the reason for part of him she could feel pressed against her stomach. He hummed and leaned down to kiss her forehead.
"Guess we'll have to come back,"
she snorted, pressing her cheek against his chest. "So you can save me from the perils of metal?" His chest shook with laughter.
"I will endeavour to save you from all manner of danger, metals included."
"You're so dramatic."
"Being part of the undead has made me even more dramatic too. However will you deal with me?"
The following weekends were accompanied by several more eye rolls from Hermione as she dragged Draco to several Muggle areas including parks, other museums, and even a few exhibits outside of England, and several mutterings in what Hermione would argue was reluctant enjoyment by Draco wherever they went, if the way he tried to hide his smile as he looked away from her was any indication. That earned him another eye roll. One time Hermione brought Draco to an old bookstore in her hometown that she used to frequent with her parents before she sent them to Australia. She had never been able to restore the obliviation charm of them. She wondered if Wendell and Monica Wilkins had found a new store to browse through together, skimming the books the way she had, her mother looking at her father scouring the shelves for a specific book, the same way Hermione looked at Draco. When he noticed her sad expression, he worked over and asked if she was okay, wiping tears away that she hadn't known were there. Draco tugged Hermione up a nearby winding staircase, walking up and finding a deserted corner before sitting down with Hermione and pulling her into his chest, rubbing soothing circles into her back as she cried and told him of all the things she had given up. That night, while a storm as heavy as her burdens rained down upon the manor, Hermione climbed onto Draco's lap and lost herself in the warmth of him, wondering how she ever thought he could be cold. His mouth, his body, even his voice felt like they were building and releasing an inferno inside of her. When Draco bit her neck and sucked her aching blood out of her, inhaling in deep breaths as she took pauses, Hermione wondered about the potential of starlight burning its way through her nerves, and if she always had the ability to feel the heat of someone, of him, when everything else felt so cold. 4 months and 16 different versions of the proposal, and there was finally progress. Everly, Campbell, and Dodge were all responsive to Hermione's new legislation, approving it to go before the legislature next month. Hermione offered each of them her hand, even extending courtesy to Ackley, but all he did was stand angrily and storm out of the room, the marblestone clacking beneath his shoes. The Wisingamot members looked at each other, and then Hermione, weariness painting their features in the same way Hermione felt. Before Hermione could speak, Dodge spoke up.
"Not to worry, my dear. Mr. Ackley was actually relieved of his position some weeks past, after an investigation into his work conduct revealed acts of overt bigotry and favoritism for certain people."
He said the word apprehensively, looking away from her. "Non-purebloods?" she asked. He nodded gravely.
"I'm afraid so. Rather grimy business, Dad. Dumbledore would never stand for it if he were here,"
he said, enunciating his point with a slap to the back of his chair. Hermione grimaced at the overzealous assessment of Dumbledore, but nodded sagely in return as the conversation continued. Everly and Campbell nodded in agreement. "He also seemed to have a particular disdain for female Muggleborns," Everly said. "We will not share details of his statement, but there were such type of horrid proclamations that they should be burned upon first opening of the mouth." Hermione nodded, unsurprised that this was the cause of his vehemence towards Hermione, but she was mainly relieved that he would no longer be part of the proceedings for legislation. The ministry would always be a place of bureaucracy, Hermione thought bitterly. "Thank you for your time today," Hermione said politely, lowering her head. I will see you all at the official hearing." She practically skipped out of the room, hurrying to her office to get her coat before she met Draco at the Flue, so they could go take their scheduled portkey to Vienna tonight. They had tickets to a reprise of Elizabeth, Draco gifting her the tickets and a 3-day trip to Austria as a birthday present. She couldn't tell which one of them had been more excited, and she smiled at the memory of his face, how he looked at her when she said she'd be delighted to go with him. As she was exiting the department with her bag and coat in hand, she felt a cold hand grab her and force her against the wall. It had collided with a rough stone, and Hermione experienced a rush of dizzying pain to her head. She opened her eyes, ready to thwart the attacker, and locked eyes with Simon Ackley. "What are you doing?" Hermione said, trying to reach for a wand, but he knocked off of her before she could take a defensive stand. "You are attacking a ministry employee."
"Oh, shut up, you dirty mudblood,"
he snarled as Hermione started pulling away from his grip. Hermione's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" Now the real thrashing started, and she tried to forcefully get his iron grip off her wrist. If she squeezed any harder, she was afraid he might break the bones. He seemed either unworried that they would be caught, which was fair considering the late hour of the day, or he simply didn't care and was looking at her with malicious intent.
"You know,"
he said smoothly, his deep voice raspy over the edges, causing a quiver to roll down Hermione's spine.
"I thought that maybe after the war mudbloods could have cemented themselves among the civilized, that they would see that wars were only brought on when you go too ahead of your stations in life."
Hermione looked at Ackley in horror. What was this insane man going on about?
"But it seems I was wrong,"
continued.
"Only some mudbloods have the capability of knowing their betters. Look at Mr. Dean Thomas. He's a quiet sort, never steps out of line and respects his superiors,"
he said. Hermione clenched her jaw. "No, Ackley," she said, voice rising in the hopes that someone would hear them, but also in her rising ire because of his loathsome person standing in front of her. "Dean is a quiet sort because he always has been since we were kids, not because he's a muggle-born learning his place. That you think people who are less loud in their activism are the only ones who should be hard is your own condemnation, not the witches and wizards who choose to fight for others. Now remove your hands from me, right this instant," she yelled. Ackley's face looked like it was going to fracture in his anger, his usually handsome features contorting into something ugly and dark. A blood vessel looked like it was close to bursting near his temple.
"Now listen here, you filthy little mudblood,"
he snarled, punctuating his words with several bashes of her head against the stone.
"You are nothing more than a waste of space, a human-sized thorn in my side these last few years, and the reason for the loss of my career,"
he snarled, his hands, long and delicate, looking like the ones she knew intimately, but with much more malicious intent than Draco's ever were, reached for her neck, and Hermione's fingers started clawing at his arm as he put pressure on her throat. She closed her eyes, tears falling as she felt the air leaving her brain. His body pinned Hermione's to the wall, suffocating her at every angle as his hands squeezed. She could feel her energy waning, and just before she felt her arms drop, Ackley's hands were roughly removed from her throat, and Hermione let out a gasping breath as she fell to her knees. She opened her eyes to see Draco pummeling Ackley, the once handsome man's face being beaten black and blue. Draco's face was one of white-hot rage, as his fist connected again and again and again. She pulled herself up on shaky knees, heaving for air, at the same time as voices sounded down the hall, and turned to see Harry and 3 other Aurors run towards them. When Harry saw her, he ran even faster. She quickly reached Draco, reaching for his arm so he would stop. "Draco, stop!" she pleaded, voice hoarse, as she tried removing his hands from Ackley, but he was so much bigger than her that she could barely keep a grin on him. Stop, for goodness sake, I'm fine. You need to stop or they will arrest you. Draco stopped, looking at Hermione with such fierce expression that she felt the air leave her once again. He dropped the broken man like he was nothing more than a rag doll and faced Hermione, gently reaching for her face as he examined the lightly deep bruising forming on her throat.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Hermione,
he said, his voice breaking over the words.
You were late, and I was worried. I should have come sooner.
She took hold of his bloodied knuckles and gripped them. It's not your fault, Hermione said. He attacked me out of nowhere. You came, that's all that matters.
Hermione,
came Harry's worried voice. She turned around and saw Harry and the other Aurors pointing their wands at them. No, at Draco. Sensing their plans to arrest him, she swerved to stand in front of him, keeping herself in between Draco and the ones trained on him. She was standing to his chest, and his dark robes were framing her as she glared at everyone.
Ranger,
Draco said, trying to remove his arms from her grip, but she kept such a tight hold on him that her nails were sinking into his skin under his shirt. Harry, you cannot arrest him, she stated. Ackley attacked me, and Draco only came to save me. He is not in the wrong here. Harry's eyes widened, looking from Hermione, Draco, and the unconscious Ackley a few feet away from them.
Hermione, look at the man,
he said, gesturing to Ackley on the ground.
That was way more than necessary force.
Yes, well, I could say the same thing about myself. I'm sure the bruising on my neck will suffice as evidence, she said fiercely. Harry looked at her, then up at Draco, who she felt breathing heavily on her, and then back at her, before nodding in understanding.
I'm so sorry. He has to be taken in,
he said, putting up a placating hand as she tried to argue with him.
Well, because you're the victim, you will need to come as well, so you can come with him.
Hermione begrudgingly nodded, feeling the fight leave her. If not for the steady hold of Draco's hands on her elbows, she would have collapsed into a heap on the floor. The entire ordeal had left her in a vulnerable state, and she might have started crying if she were not several Aurors and an awkward Harry still looking at her with a bemused look, lightning in his green eyes. It was then that she realized the fierceness with which she cared for Draco. It was exhilarating and terrifying, and several other emotions all at once. She turned to him, and he was looking at her with a relieved face, and he lifted his hand to her face to caress her cheek.
I'm so sorry,
he said, hands shaking against her. She placed her hand on his, leaning into his warm touch as she smiled up at him. There is nothing to be sorry for, except, maybe, us missing the portkey to Vienna, she said, trying for levity as she felt the Aurors approach from behind. He dropped his hand, eyeing the Aurors warily as she stepped away from her. She felt a pang of worry when they conjured magical binding ropes to tie his wrists behind his back. She turned to Harry, who placed his hand on Hermione's shoulder and began to inspect her injuries. She still eyed Draco, who wasn't even looking at her but Harry's hand. A dark expression on his face. Hermione blushed. Harry, I'm fine, he said, but he didn't listen. He looked her over until he seemed satisfied and took her in his arms. We'll walk to the Deal Mean now with Malfoy, he explained.
Ackley will be transported as well and interrogated when he's healed and conscious.
Hermione shivered at Ackley's name. Okay. They walked over to the DMLE, where Hermione was seated at Harry's desk as he asked one of the junior Aurors to fetch her some tea. She didn't drink it, keeping her eye on the room she knew Draco was in. She couldn't stop fidgeting, and after taking her witness statement, she told Harry that she would get her throat healed later. He objected, but Hermione said she wasn't going anywhere until Draco was released. Huffing, Harry stumped over to Draco's room and shut the door, and Hermione was left to wait. After a few hours, the door opened, and Harry walked out with Draco in tow, the other Auror who was with them ducking into a different room. Hermione stood and walked over to him, reaching for Draco's hand at the same time he reached for her. She almost didn't notice the look Harry sent away. Uncaring, she turned towards him. So, what's going on? Is he going to be charged?
Let it be known that the boy who lived is still willing to break the rules.
And he glared at Draco's snort.
Malfoy, who I just apparently found out is a vampire, thanks for letting me know, Hermione.
He derided, and Hermione had the sense to look guiltily up at him,
has rights protecting him for using more than necessary force if he believes someone is in danger. But you already knew that, so the only thing remaining is if the victim, you, want to press charges. Only against Ackley, she stated. He nodded. I thought so, he said. Well, you two can leave for now. We have both of your witness statements, but you and I are going to have a long talk tomorrow, Hermione, he said, his tone brokering no argument. Hermione regarded her best friend amusedly. Yes, Adora Potter, she replied, a teasing lilt in her voice that she needed to stem her from her exhaustion. Harry rolled his eyes and patted Hermione on the shoulder, looking at Malfoy once with a nod before leaving them alone. Hermione turned to look at Draco, eyeing him warily, his tired gaze fixed upon her throat. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, she said. I just need to get myself healed and then go get some rest. I can heal you. But he stopped himself, his face wilting. Hermione gave him a sad smile. Healing doesn't just involve once. You have several healing potions in your cabinet for both of us, she said, grabbing his hands, with both his and Ackley's dried blood smattered on them. He smiled ruefully. That I do. After fleeing back to the manor, Hermione performed healing charms on the bruises on her throat, much worse than even she had thought they were, and dabbed some dittany on Draco's hands. When she went to dab it on herself, he swatted her hands away, insisting on doing it for her. He used gentle hands to rub the soreness away, making Hermione feel like she was spun glass, ready to unravel at any moment. Will you tell me why he attacked you? He asked, hands massaging their scents in soft circles longer than it was necessary. I asked Potter, but he was vague. Hermione bit her lip, not wanting to divulge her legislation until she won. She decided to speak mostly the truth. Simon Ackley is, or was now, a senior Wizengamot member, she said. Draco nodded. Yeah, I know who he is. He's very well liked among the pure-blood elite. He rolled his eyes. What I don't understand is why he attacked you. He's hated me for years, and tonight he told me the reason why, Hermione said. After the war, he seems to have gotten it into his head that while Muggleborns did undoubtedly exist and have magical talent, they should be subdued and know their place. He said I was all wrong with his conception of that, always thwarting him in my activism. Draco curled his lip. So he just decided tonight that he would attack you specifically? He said, anger rising in his voice. Hermione sat up and clasped both of his hands with hers. He was investigated recently because of the way he was acting as an overseer of a recent project of mine. After the investigation concluded, it was found that other Muggleborns heard him say several passive-aggressive comments about their heritage. He was fired, but because the Ministry wanted to keep hush about it, they let him finish any work he had remaining. He narrowed his eyes at her. Which project? Something important, she said evasively. I'll tell you about it when I have more firm hand on it. He eyed her warily a moment and looked like he was about to press the issue before Hermione's stomach gave a great big growl. She giggled and Draco glared at her. I'll have Wimbley bring some warm food for you. She nodded and wrapped herself around him in a tired hug, feeling so drawn out it was a miracle she could keep her eyes open. Draco unfolded his arms around her and pressed her against his chest. I won't let anyone hurt you again, he promised. She looked up at him, smiling tremulously. I won't either, she said fiercely, holding tight to him the same way he did to her. To be continued. Thank you for listening to 8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.